Hey, Link here. Thanks for joining me for episode 73, where I speak with Phillip Woytowitz, also known as Mr.Thee, developer of the upcoming game Olliefrog Toad Skater. We talk about the staples such as Olliefrog Toad Skater, how he got started in the industry, and some words of wisdom from his experiences, the game that made him want to get into development, his favorite game, as well as things he does outside of gaming. Outside of the staples, though, we talk about the rise of frogs in video games, Smash Bros. And games like Smash Bros., as well as games that Smash Bros. Influences can be seen in. Before we get started, don't forget there are links in the episode description that you can follow to learn more about Philip and the game to Olliefrog Toad Skater, as well as the podcast. Also, don't forget to like and share the episode, and feel free to comment on your own favorite game or Smash Bros. Like games. Without further ado, please enjoy episode 73. Hi, welcome to the Red Tunic Podcast, a podcast where I look to rediscover what makes gaming fun and enjoyable by having positive conversations with those related to the industry. My name is Link, and today I'm joined by Phillip Woytowitz, known as Mr.Thee, developer of Olliefrog Toad Skater. Hi, Phillip. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. My cat's with me on my lap, and I have been using a saintly level of self-restraint to make sure I don't sneeze.
Well, I'm glad your day is going okay so far, and I wish you the best of luck. I don't know where to go with that one. I am sorry.
That's fine. I will persist. So we'll just wait until he gets bored. But we can go ahead.
Awesome. So, Philip, before we get started, would you mind telling me and anyone listening a little bit about yourself, and as well, if you want, maybe throw in a little bit of information about your current projects?
So, like you already laid out, I'm an indie game developer. I've been making stuff for about 13 years in various capacities, from hobby scale to working at AAA companies to working for mobile studios to doing contracts here and there. And my current creative baby is, as you mentioned, Olliefrog Toad Skater, which I'm shooting to release next year. It is a game about skateboarding frogs. And yeah,
sorry.
We've been working on it since about December 2021, and we've been having a blast getting that thing fleshed out and in front of people.
Awesome, and that's really cool to hear. And a few things I wanted to kind of bounce off of, just on the topic of Olliefrog Toad Skater. And I tried the demo when during one of the Steam Next Fests, I believe it was, or one of their festival thingies. And then I also tried it at PAX, tried a more updated build. And I just want to say I really have enjoyed the time I did get to play around with it.
Thank you.
I think it is a really amusing. I don't know the right word. I think it's just an amusing and adorable medium to interject into a skateboarding game. And I believe when we were talking at PAX, I mentioned one of my favorite things. I don't know if this was on an older build that from one of the festival things, or a more recent one, and I only saw it just recently at PAX. But the whole when you wipe out, just the look on your face, it made me feel really good and not angry in the slightest when I screwed up and just ate dirt, because it just you look, your character is just adorable and it looks so funny. It just sort of it takes away any and all kind of frustration for not pulling something off. So I just wanted to make a note of that, or mention of that, because like I said, it's fun what I've had from it, but that part, that adorable thing about it especially, just absolutely tickled me.
Thank you. Yeah, it just kind of felt natural to do, because skateboarding IRL is already kind of frustrating and hard, and nobody likes to eat it. So adding some gracious failure, or even a form of positive feedback, so people are encouraged to almost purposefully bail, is kind of neat to play with. And the squeaky toy was just oh, what if it did this? And then I just took a bunch of recordings of dog toys, and randomized which one to do on playback, and that's something I want to say like maybe 40% of playtesters point out and compliment because it's kind of unusual, but also like makes a lot of sense. But it still catches them off guard. So I'm doing something right there.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm happy more, a good chunk of people are catching that and enjoying it as well. Just because, like I said, that I'm not a huge, skateboarder. And by that I mean not really in the slightest. My skateboarding career quickly ended when I was younger and flew off a curb and bounced my head off the curb, and that was kind of the end of me
Ooh.
ever bothering again. But like getting to enjoy these games is always super fun, and like getting to enjoy them with an amusing and like interesting twist is even better in my mind. So yeah, I'm glad other people are enjoying, the adorableness approach, or however everyone wants to put it. That's how I'm putting it at the very least.
That's good.
I also wanted to ask something, and just because I it's something that I think many people, and I don't know if if it factored in for you guys, or for you when you were like starting out, or what have you. But recently there's been a lot of like frog inspired kind of game things, and was that just like a happy kind of coincidence when you started with the frog, or was Olliefrog Toad Skater kind of a thing that came about around that time of like that one game jam where like everyone did frogs and then frogs exploded out? I hope what I'm asking makes sense.
Yeah. I think what you're saying. So the original concept was, so I started Dev December 2021, but the original concept was from a private game jam I had with a couple friends, and that was in April that same year. Um, Somebody brought up a similar question when I did a Reddit AMA around the time of the Kickstarter last year, basically saying why are there so many frogs in video games now? And my conclusion, well, so excuse me, so frogs have always sort of been a popular subject matter along with most animals, but I think what people are starting to realize is that unlike designing human characters, where off the bat there's a bit of intrepidation most consumers will have staring at any sort of human character in any medium because people have like neutral trust with people. But if you put a human in front of like an animal or something which doesn't know any better or has like no way on society, they are more open to it. And so that's why you're seeing a bunch of animal games more recently. But I think the reason you're seeing a bunch of frog games is sort of a counterculture against sort of like a lot of right wing media and politics. And frogs have this interesting property of being round and appealing to look at, but they're also one of the few like natural hermaphrodites in nature. And so there are some species of frogs, like the common reed frog, which actually switch genders throughout their lifetime, in various ecosystems, both natural and unnatural. So I think that's another reason some people have like subtly gravitated towards it. It's a very gender neutral but also gender fluid type of animal, which is just round and easy to depict and draw and look at. I think another animal which occupies a very similar popularity space in consumers' minds are foxes. It's like both them and frogs sort of live on like the second tier of popular animals, and of course the zeroth, like the first tier, the top tier, the most popular animals are going to be like cats and dogs. And you do see those a lot in games, obviously, but once you get one tier below, you get slightly more niche, but also just slightly more ubiquitous in terms of frogs and foxes are sitting right next to each other there. At least that's the way I view it.
So that like thank you for your view on that. I'm trying to think of the best way to like to go from there, because that's like everything you said is a very interesting view. I'm trying to think of like the best way to say it that doesn't in any way unintentionally make it sound like dismissive or what have you. I want to be very careful on that one, but no, but that that's an interesting like approach or take. I'd never thought of any of it like from that angle. So thank you for kind of introducing me to that, because that's, like I said, that's an interesting angle. And
I also just
I
like
don't know.
frogs. I think a lot of people like frogs, but I think what people have realized over the past like few years is that there's a lot of playable character subject matters that are left untouched. Why not we just use a bunch of animals? And I think that's fine and also innovative.
I also agree. Like that is an approach or a view or an angle, what have you, that I've already kind of explored in my head, and I agree completely with what you're saying. Because like it's like who doesn't like, well, as I'm 35, I grew up on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I grew up watching Biker Mice on Mars. And all of like the other weird little attempts. So like I 100% agree with you on that from that angle, especially because like, who doesn't like seeing I hate this word, anthropomorphized. I hate it because I can't pronounce it. But who doesn't like seeing an animal that's humanized like that doing cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I 100% from that angle as well. I agree with you on that one. And as I said, thank you for the interesting other angle that I will probably end up investigating or thinking on myself, just because that is a very interesting approach to it. And like, it intrigues me to learn more or what have you. Again, I'm being very careful to not like say anything that unintentionally sounds dismissive. I want to be very clear and
Sure,
careful on that one.
I could hear like some of the tension in your pauses, so don't worry about it. Just loosen up. You'll be fine.
Well, thank you. Um, so, Philip, I do want to ask, because as you said, you've worked on, several smaller projects. You've done some contracting, mobile games, some AAAs, what have you. It sounds basically like you've been all over the place, more and or less in the grand scheme. Would you mind maybe speaking to how it is you got into developing and making games, and maybe, and if you forget this part of the question, I'll circle back around. But if you have any words of wisdom that you've learned the hard way that you can share to help other people, maybe not learn as hard as you, by all means, like, can you speak to that?
Sure. So, give me a second. I'm gonna let the cat out of this room because the door's been going in and out. So just give me a hot second.
Sure thing.
Sorry about that. Okay.
No worries.
So, let's see. So I've wanted to make games since I was in like the middle of high school, but pretty much the only tool chains that were available in like 2008, 2009 that were recommended online was you had to basically pop open a modded version of Half-Life 2 and then learn how to mod that because there were a lot of there were a lot of games at the time which were built around Source, but getting up and running in that toolchain was very difficult. But there were a lot of games, good games that were sort of built on that, like I think it was Dark Messiah, Might and Magic was one of the first games which someone pointed out to me. He's like, oh, hey, that was actually built on top of like a Half-Life 2 mod. And I'm like, oh, interesting. And so early on, I was dabbling in like some very old version of Autodesk and got sort of some basics of rigging and modeling and 3D CAD stuff there. But I didn't really sort of use Unity 3D in earnest until 2010, because February of that year, Zero Punctuation had put out their review for Mass Effect 2 for the PS3, and before each of his reviews, which came up on Wednesdays, on every Tuesday, he would do a column where he'd write about just sort of like some extra footnotes regarding the game. And around the time he put up that review, he was talking about this new free 3D game engine called Unity 3D, which people were starting to use, and that's how I caught wind of it. And then I looked up a bunch of YouTube tutorials and got into that and started doodling around with that. And that's sort of how I got my start. And shortly after that, I wanted to basically vertically integrate my own skill set and pipeline because I had the time because I was a high schooler. And so that's when I also took up learning. I already had known a bit of GIMP, but that's also when I started learning Blender. and started learning how to model, rig, and animate from that. And at that point, I had taken like one community college class on C++ programming, and some of that knowledge transferred over to what was sort of Unity's version of JavaScript or ActionScript. Uh, they were .js files, but they were actually another language called UnityScript. I'm not going to get into that, but basically, I had all the tools I needed to make crappy little 3D games for myself. So that's how I got started. But my career developed, I would say. I was still always like doing side projects in Unity 3D. Towards the end of high school, throughout my whole undergrad, but during my computer science and engineering undergrad, I got all my good fundamentals in 3D math. And I took an OpenGL class there, learned a bit more C++, and just some other like computer science fundamentals, along with a few physics classes because there was like a technical breadth required in UCLA's engineering undergrad program, which was very handy because it helped me learn stuff like fluid dynamics and physics stuff. But then out of college, my first job was at NVIDIA doing hardware infrastructure stuff with a bit of like graphics knowledge for one of the tools they had there. And then that place kind of sucked. And then I bounced around like through 5 different gaming contracts across like mobile and middleware places, mostly a bunch of AR companies and mobile companies, which needed like a little bit of low level programming and graphics knowledge. Then I was at my first like game studio gig proper, which is at Top Golf Media, and they were working on a mobile title. I worked there for a couple years, and then I left, and then I did the Kickstarter for Olliefrog, and that went well. But between all of those gigs, it was a lot of always doing side projects like Warp Soldier or The Deepest House, or these smaller things which I maybe worked on for like 18 months, 24 months, and then put out there with like very little marketing effort, mostly just as a close the loop exercise and shipping stuff out there. And on top of just like a bunch of smaller game jams and concepts and demos. But after around the time I was still at NVIDIA, I was able to get a headline with a side project I was doing there. Very simple, like almost pachinko esque uh, golf gardening game called The Growth Project, which got me my first rock paper shotgun headline. And that made me sort of realize, oh hey, my sort of taste and design sensibilities are sort of relevant to people. And so I'm able to be trendy on that front, and then I just decide to lean into it for all my future projects, which is sort of why Olliefrog looks the way he is. Like, he's very relevant, he's very hip, he's very much something people will have gravitated towards. And yeah, that's pretty much my story. I kind of jumped around there in the timeline, but that maybe gives you a good sense of how I got to where I am. I could go into more details later if you're curious. But I think my one piece of advice I would give people is do what you can during your school days or whatever to find a good creative partner if you can, because that's going to be the difference between like you being able to make a hit game in like 3 4 years versus like however long it took me to get to this point, because I've mostly been working as a traditional solo dev during like the mid 2010s, I would say, but it wasn't towards like pandemic era or right before the pandemic started that I really started to ask for help more often. And the other thing I would also recommend newcomers to do is start 2D. There are some nice long-term benefits if you learn 3D stuff. You could get some very good paying gigs if you're like a seasoned 3D tech artist or FX worker. But if you start on 2D, you'll be able to just like crank out and iterate more in design spaces so much faster and still be able to put out something which resonates with a lot of audiences. I think that's maybe my biggest regret was not starting 2D. I was very ambitious and wanted to do 3D stuff off the bat, and that has paid off in some ways. And I sort of don't regret those decisions, but I do often wonder what it would be like if I just used a sprite, had enough patience with Game Maker, because back then, like 2010, 2011, Game Maker was not very good. And so I had just sort of been sitting on Unity 3D since.
So thank you for walking me and everyone listening through your story, regardless of, as you put it, the timeline skipping around there. That's really interesting just to hear, going from playing around in like high school or what have you, and through school, and then landing more as like a hardware-ish focused thing through NVIDIA. And then, working your way between and through different smaller projects or what have you, like however you want to put them, smaller studios or whatnot, to then, getting a Kickstarter, a successful, I'm presuming, or from what I'm guessing.
Yeah, we succeeded.
Uh,
We had a goal of 35K last year, and we hit 43K. Um,
uh,
yeah, so we nailed that. Thank God.
which congratulations, by the way, just because I know Kickstarters are not the least stressful things to go through. So congratulations on that, and hopefully that took some stress off for what you guys are working on and putting out there. But thank you for walking, for sharing that story as well as the words of wisdom. I think that's really interesting. To like I 100% understand the iteration aspect of it, and I'd never thought that 2D would be a little easier. However, to iterate with. However, I can it would be easy to see how and why, because you're not dealing with as many different variables as you're trying to figure things out. So yeah, so like that's an interesting way to go about it, and I think that's a good piece of advice for anyone that just sort of wants to jump in and they don't know. They want to limit the amount of things they have to stress about when jumping in. If my interpretation makes sense.
Yeah, that's pretty correct. It's just when you go from 2D to 3D, there's a whole order of magnitude of work you have to worry about. You have to worry about topology, you have to worry about rigging, you have to worry about UV mapping, you have to worry about just like keyframing animations. In one sense, 2D is nicer but also harder in some respects, where some sprite animations are just straight up more expensive to animate in 2D than it is to like sort of animate them in 3D. But it's the number of sort of like different steps you have to take in 3D which gets really arduous and taxing. UV mapping, rigging, animating, and also making sure that all looks good in 3D and in the context of that world. And maybe you have to add particle effects or shadows or other blemishes. Whereas in 2D, you you have much more in terms of like design affordances, and so things you could get away with using much fewer assets in a 2D project than you can using minimal assets in a 3D project. It's kind of like when you up-res an N64 game that maybe doesn't hold up as well because the eye is expecting more per pixel, I guess is what happens there. It's this whole topic. But yeah, start 2D if you can and just wrangle things down on that front first. Unless if you're like crazy like me or take pride in like having a good math and 3D art background.
So again, I thank you for that advice. Everything you said, I understand, it makes sense, and I think it'll probably resonate with others and make sense to them as well. So thank you for that.
You are welcome. Yes,
so
tread lightly.
tread lightly. I do want to ask this one because you said you because of like zero punctuation, you learned about Unity and and all of that, the whole process. But I am curious, was there, and I don't know if this is just going to be because Mass Effect 2 is what introduced you to Unity, so to say, but like, was there a game or games plural that made you want to make games, and like, why, or what was it about, that game or games or what have you that kind of influenced you?
I mean, the game I usually cite as being like a sort of inspirational kernel for me saying I want to dedicate my life to this is probably Ocarina of Time, because I was like 5 when that came out, and like I didn't have the motor skills to like pick up an N64 controller or do any like sort of like real time games. Like I could play like maybe Mario Party or Pokemon Stadium or something, but watching my brother and all of his friends go through that game, it was just like there just literally wasn't like anything like that game at the time, and that sort of transcends not just in video games but just in forms of like TV media in general. Like it was just so mind blowing that I wanted to play. It just inspired me a lot, and stimulated all of my creative senses that I just sort of wanted to, ever since then, just approach that again, if that makes sense. Like it's very hard to understate the impression that game sort of left on me, and it made me want to sort of like dedicate learning a craft to making games as spectacular as perhaps that one day, and leave a similar impression on others going forward.
So I definitely understand, how and why Ocarina of Time would do that to you. Um, you know, I've shared this before, and it's not like anything as big or in depth as you, but like for me, the first time I like got hands on or just watched like a demo of it or what have you, it was mind blowing because up until that point, for me at least, it was like Mario 64, which is a whimsical and fantastical what have you, or some other 64 games. But Ocarina of Time, was like a immersive experience as one could have on like that hardware. So like I definitely get how and why that game would have been like such a fundamental pillar in influencing you or what have you, just because it is it's like a gold standard in what the Nintendo 64 era or what that generational era really could offer. So like yeah, 100%. It's also such a fantastic game to be inspired by. So like thank you for sharing that. That's a great game and a great foundation pillar. Sorry, I don't know how to summarize the end part there.
Yeah, we'll just call it influential. I did put out like a top. There was this thing going around Twitter of like top 25 games on your list through like a Topstar web page. That game was definitely in the top five, plus a few others.
So I don't know if this is going to be like a similar answer for you then. However, do you have a favorite game? Like, I don't know if your favorite game is going to be the one that, was the most influential or what have you. But if there is, and it's a different one, what would that one be?
That's a good. It's like the way this question sometimes comes up is like, what is the best game of all time and what is your favorite game? I would say the best game of all time is Majora's Mask, actually, because that builds such a unique atmosphere with a very limited set of resources, and no one's been able to come close to sort of like the sort of dread and, well, it's like a cocktail of dread and melancholy, but also a bit of magic in terms of the way sort of characters interact in that space and the stories they have to tell and the lives they have to cope and go through over and over again. So in that sense, I think as a compelling piece of media, Majora's Mask is like head and shoulders above most of the other landscape, even more so than Ocarina of Time, I would say. But I think my favorite game might just be Super Smash Bros. Melee for the Nintendo GameCube, because it's a fun game. People still play it competitively for a reason, and this is also just true for a lot of game creators of my generation, like Doki Doki Literature Club, Undertale. Like so many of those games have sort of pulled from that in some manner or fashion, and I wouldn't hesitate to call Super Smash Brothers Melee like, I don't know if it's the best game of all time, but it's certainly the game of a generation of creators and developers. Yeah.
So thank you for a few different things you said there, for answering that as a whole. Just a few different things you said there. I didn't have a GameCube, so I unfortunately like missed out on that whole generation. So I'm like, are you able to speak to how or why you feel Melee is such an influence? Because I miss that, so I don't see those influences, or I might not be aware of what those influences is, and I'm wondering if you can maybe educate me a little.
Sure. I mean, like, there's an explosion of platform fighters over the past, like, 5-10 years. You've seen games like Rivals of Aether, you've seen other games like Nick All-Stars Brawl, Multiverses, pretty much every single one of those games' design templates is derived from Melee in some respect. Like, there's a little bit of advanced movement tech. It's still like easy to approach and play. You don't have to worry about like getting your quarter circles right or certain like sequential button direction sequences. Well, so all of those games are very accessible because of that. But also just sort of like the other metaculture aspects of just sort of like ever since like the Melee documentary exploded on the competitive scene in like 2013, there's just been a whole new wave of just internet cultural memes which poke fun at everything from like Mango's in jail to Leffen is being Leffen doing Leffen things to the point where there's an AI bot mocking his Reddit posts and tweets, which lays down some real truth, and it's really interesting to just see like how the competitive scene has evolved since that documentary, and all of it is just rooted in like this silly little party game which at the time just had kind of insane production values, like very big roster, lots of trophies, lots of things to do. Melee was just a very massive game and such a massive step over the N64 iteration. Like, I remember seeing screenshots of it in Nintendo Power. My brother was pointing it out to me, my older brother, and just being like, "Oh, whoa, this game is going to be insane when it comes out." And it was insane, and still is insane in some respects. Because every iteration from Melee has sort of toned the speed back a bit, and also just pulled back a lot of the flow. Like, you can look at a character like Captain Falcon and how he plays across all Smash games, and in Melee, he's definitely the most fluid. He keeps all of his momentum and going in directions. But if we look at places where Melee has sort of had an interesting influence, like the creator of Doki Doki Literature Club, Dan Salvato, got his start off in the online creative space by just making the 20XX hack pack and hacking, doing ROM hacks of Melee so that you could play modded versions of the game just with a modded GameCube memory card, which was from like a computer science perspective, that's already kind of like an insane feat because that's a bunch of low level assembly wrangling PowerPC stuff you have to do. And just like the amount of creativity you've and there are other places where you can just see how inspirational Melee's creativity was. Like, there's a very prominent YouTuber, Ludwig Ogren or something, but he got his start off in the Melee community, doing a little bit of commentary, acting as a guest on some like Melee celebrity functions here and there, like the roast of was he on the roast of Hugs? I don't remember, but he sort of both him and Slime and a number of members of the Yard got their start off in the Melee community in sort of like different aspects, and now the Yard is like the top grossing podcast on Patreon last time I checked. And then going back to Undertale, Toby Fox has gone on record to say that I think he is a Falco main, and he still alludes to that aspect in a lot of his works. And similar to Dan Salvato, the way he got his start off wasn't through modding Melee, but it was actually modding Mother 2 or Earthbound. And so in that sense, he and Dan Salvato had very similar career paths, but Melee has sort of touched them in both ways. And there are other indie developers who have like taken notes and cues from Super Smash Bros. Melee, like SBF Games. They made the launch title for the Switch called Snipper Clips, but the SBF and SBF Games comes from their old Newgrounds Flash moniker, Super Flash Brothers, and there are some doodles of like these two players playing Marth and Falco on a bed, and in the Marth's mind, he's got the super analytical, calculated depiction of, oh, this is how you should space it. But the Captain Falcon player is just sort of like ballistic and just wants to land a single Falcon punch. That drawing you see in the documentary comparing like those two play styles was from SBF. I forget if it was Tom or Dim, but one of the folks from that crew. So it's not very obvious at first, but if you dig a little closer into it, like a lot of modern indie games, be them platform fighters or not, you will find Melee's influence specifically in there in some way or form.
So thank you for that. And that's really interesting to hear or to know, just because like I said, I missed that generation. But it's interesting because it always, like, I always think it's cool when there are games that inspire so many people, and like everyone takes their own little bit of that game into how they move forward or what they want to do as they move forward. So thank you for that. I did not know about the like cultural impact or what have you for Melee, and I'm going to look into that more as well, just because I'm now curious just how wide those wings spread, or some other better fitting analogy. But thank you for that.
Mhm.
So, Philip, I am curious about this then, because and I think like this question, like this is a amalgamation of two questions, or you can interpret any either which way. But like it sounds like you might be someone that has played a lot of Melee and a lot of games similar to Melee, or followed games similar to Melee. Do you have like a do you have like a Melee favorite that isn't really as well known, or you don't think did too well? Like I know the Nickelodeon one, the more recent one. I think there was another one that did more recently that also didn't do too well. I don't like, not the Nickelodeon one, some other one. But I'm just wondering, like, as someone that knows a little bit more about that scene than me, if there's one of those that you had hoped would do better and didn't, or what have you.
Interesting question. Yeah, Multiverses did kind of drop the ball because that game had insane budget, and you can sort of see in like the animation and rigging quality of a lot of their characters. I think the hardest part about making a platform fighter is understanding just like good character animation flow, because when that looks too jerky, it takes you out of the experience and it's harder to connect with those players at a very visceral level. And I think one place, this is very much a minor nitpick. I don't know if it's ultimately what led to its downfall, but I think Multiverse's biggest issue was just sort of the way your character's aerial momentum behaves when you do certain attacks. Like, I do appreciate that it's sort of going for a 2v2 setup in order to differentiate itself. I think that's an interesting, smart move. Just taking doubles as a platforming fighting game set up seriously. But that also has the drawback of singles is a lot less interesting to watch. Because some characters just aren't built for that well. Like some characters, I think, like Velma and stuff, are more support based. But what sort of drives me insane, and this is very much because my brain is sort of rooted in the way that Melee works, but it's also a function of it just kind of looks weird by itself, where when you do certain attacks, you lose like 90% of your downward vertical momentum if you're descending. And maybe that's so you can do better air combos and stuff and juggles, but it's just another one of those weird interruptions of flow, because there are sort of two ways you could interrupt flow. You could either make the character take a very weird animation state, and another game, another platform fighter, which has sort of like been very guilty of this, is Rushdown Revolt, which was formerly known as Icon's Battle Arena, which, God, when did it debut? It was at like EVO 2017, 2018, I think. And eventually that company folded, and they had they had the other flow issue of that the characters' animations were a bit jerky going from certain state to certain state. And there's a bit of subtle jerkiness to Melee's character animations, like there's no crossfading, but the way they get around that is that the start of the keyframes of certain attacks on their prior states are just close enough to each other where they can sort of get away with that. And that's something Nintendo's always been really about doing, is making sure their characters animations always sort of flow into each other, even though they aren't like perfectly seamless. Um, that's something I learned scrubbing through individual frames of certain like Melee characters' attacks when I was starting off early on learning Blender and learning how to animate things and trying to see how they broke their characters down and did they implement certain animation blending means. And it turns out they don't do a lot of that blending. They just have like very good compositional chops. Um, and not having those chops is how you end up with games like Rushdown Revolt, which are a bit jerky going from frame to frame. There's a few other factors holding that game back, just in terms of like how that sort of business was laid out and how those contractors were set up and how that player base was kept in check. But that's a whole separate conversation.
So, thank you for that answer. And I've never heard of Rushdown Revo. I'm curious about it. DC the multiverse, or the DC one you mentioned, that was the one I was struggling to remember the name of. So thank you
Mhm.
for that as well. And I'm not a huge um platform arena fighter, whatever the category Smash and similar games fall into. But I didn't know that it was a kind of like a 2v2 setup where, like you said, you had like a support character and whatnot. But like that's really interesting to learn. And I think that's like a really interesting approach that they took with that. And hopefully that's something we can see going forward, maybe from a team that I don't know how to phrase it more appropriately, but like understands a little better to make that has like the longevity or what have you in mind to keep people playing it, that doesn't offset the negatives or whatnot. Because like that's I think that's an interesting approach that would probably resonate with more people, just because I imagine seeing two characters on the screen supporting each other and everything would just create more meta and create more interesting fights for people to experience and watch, right?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of factors going in, and one of the reasons doubles is always struggling is that a lot of people argue that there's just like too much going on screen at any given point that it's hard for viewers to track. But with like a 1v1 fight, like at least with a game like Marvel or something, where it does have sort of a tag system, if there is like a third or a fourth character on the screen, they're usually not there for very long.
And that's also like a really good point. Like the new Mortal Kombat, how most of the other characters are just sort of like temporary, I'm going to call them summons or what have you, where they come in, they do a thing, and they bounce out. And other games, the way they handle that is like character swapping or having them jump in and doing some things. I'm not a huge fighting game player, so my use of terminology or what have you is very limited. But I think I said the right words there for anyone that might be more aware to know what I was trying to say.
I think the traditional term is like assist. That's sort of more
Thank
generic
you.
and works across more characters. But yeah, sort of coming from that space and going into a skateboarding game is there is a lot of interesting design overlap because at their core, there's a lot of self-expression you could do just by like doing actions into combos and the risk reward of if you get all these together, they look great, but if you biff one towards the end, it's kind of a like you just kind of blue ball it. But it builds a lot of nice tension, and so I think that's the reason why I've been having a pretty easy time sort of like developing Olliefrog from that standpoint. Even though I didn't play a ton of the Tony Hawk games growing up, I still like had a good enough working memory of how they behaved and how those mechanics worked to the point where even if I spent most of my life just like fixating on platform fighting game design, it still applied there.
And thank you for bringing that one back around, because like it's like I said before about not knowing of the impact and influence of Melee and such. Hearing how you're the how you looked at animating or what have you in like Blender, and like did what you could to interpret from how Melee worked, and what have you, what have you, what have you. It's interesting to hear like the things you learned, and similar to probably other devs, like what you took away from that and how to apply it. So thank you for bringing that around too, because that's also just really interesting to just hear the foundation of something that is not like in the same lane or even in the same book, but still know that there are lessons learned from it that you are applying and still applying.
Yeah, just lots of good multi-genre fundamentals, and like maybe all that falls under better under the umbrella of like character action, and that goes for like platforms and stuff as well, as opposed to like puzzle games. But yeah, the nice thing is that even though you might worry that you're pigeonholing your skill set to maybe one genre for long, there's still some like other genres that can still benefit from that knowledge as well.
Which, thank you, because that's also wonderful advice, to not worry about skills and knowledge that you might think is highly specific is actually something that you can apply elsewhere. Um, Now, Philip, I do want to ask this just because I don't want to take up too much more of your time. As you know, when we started out, you had mentioned that you did have something lined up after this, and you did have to get going. So I do want to fire off one more for you before I get out of your way, and that is outside of games, outside of making games or what have you. Like, what do you enjoy doing? What do you do to relax? Now, I know that this is kind of a weighted question because it very much could be playing and enjoying games. And if that is it, that's perfectly valid. However, I still like to ask it all the same, just to see if there's something you'd like to share that's about yourself that's not, entirely video game related.
Sure. Well, I like to go for walks. I like hiking. I like maybe not like super long hikes, but there's a nature reserve not far from me that's walking distance that I sometimes go to just like look around, relax, stare at the environment. Maybe there's some inspiration for another game in there because when you do this hobby for so long, you're seeing inspiration in all sorts of things if you have that sort of passion for making games in multiple genres at some point. But I also like cooking when I have time. I don't have as much time these days because of all the dev work I did, but I used to do stuff like try out more aggressive recipes or cooking setups. Like I made macaroons once a few years ago. That was fun. And also, I used to make pizzas pretty frequently. Maybe not with a pizza oven per se, but with some just like lower temperature home baking stuff. What else do I do? I have a cat. His name's Cinnamon. He's very sweet. I like to take pictures of him and doll him up occasionally in like a little bow tie and show him to my friends. So that's been a fun sort of second job.
um, so thank you for that. Now I'm gonna hit you with this one really quick. As someone that was making, like you said, you like to make a lot of pizzas or attempts at pizzas. Did you find a uncommon combination that you didn't expect to work out, and then it worked way better than you thought? And I only ask this one specifically because a few years back, my partner, she bought me the TMNT pizza book. And one of their things, I forget what the other topping was, but pickles was one of them. I've never made the attempt to do it yet. However, they say it's good. And that would be, in my opinion, a very uncommon or unexpected topping. So I'm just wondering if you also have you have a weird combination that you tried and went, oh, wow, this worked way better than it had any right to do.
I don't know if I have a stellar combination. I think one thing that worked out kind of okay, but kind of weird, but I may or may not try it again, was when I was in college, I started experimenting. I used to work out a bunch and I experimented with mixing protein powder in and things. And one time what I did was I substituted like a quarter of the flour out for like this vanilla whey protein powder I had. And it was surprisingly edible. Like obviously it wasn't perfect and it was a pretty heavy pizza to eat, but like in terms of just like general taste, like nothing, not that much was taken away from the integrity of the pie, I guess. I don't know if I would try it again. It's a lot of work, but it was surprisingly not terrible. It was kind of weird. It wasn't like spectacular, but it wasn't awful. It was very middle of the road.
So I'm happy that it wasn't a complete failure. I is like the best thing I can say, but that's also really thank you for that, because that's like an interesting thing to look at experimenting with in just general, like flour substitutes or base substitutes for the dough, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I'm glad that wasn't a complete failure, because the last thing I think anyone wants when cooking in general is to try something and have it make your food completely inedible. And I think we can all attest to experiments we've done that absolutely destroyed the integrity of food. Personally, I've done it, several times. Once I got the dumb idea to try and mix like soy sauce with eggs to do like a weird scrambled eggs, but yeah, it didn't work. Don't do that, anyone who gets the dumb idea like that. But what I'm getting at is, thank you for sharing that. I'm happy that worked for you. But yeah, like I said, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I do want to let you get on with the rest of your day with the other plans you had that you squeezed me in between. However, if there was anything else you want to discuss, like a cool game, something you feel more people should just be aware of, some other little things that you might be doing or what have you, the floor is all yours. As well, please let everyone know where they can find more information about you, which I'll also include in the episode description. And you had mentioned dressing up Cinnamon and like showing that off. If that is also one of the things you want more people to be aware of, I encourage it, because I think people would like to see that in general, because people love animals in funny little costumes and bow ties, right?
He's not rocking a bow tie right now, but I might put one back on once I get over the guilt of, I don't want to put a collar on him. Maybe he'll be naked for the rest of his life. But you can catch me at Twitter as at Phillip Woytowitz. That's PhillipWitz. On Blue Sky, you can find me as Mr.Thee, MRTHEE. I also have a TikTok as Mr.Thee Game Dev. That's MRTHEE Game Dev. Those are sort of the big socials. If you go to Olliefrog.com, that's where you can find the Steam page for Olliefrog. There's a free demo there. It's got some bugs. Some people have fallen through the floor, but if you want to send me a clip of that bug happening, that's totally fine, because I still need to debug it before my next upcoming functions, which are technically under wraps. But keep an eye on my Twitter, or maybe even the Kickstarter update pages for where you'll be able to see me in person next. In terms of shoutouts or other games that folks should play, I've been playing a lot of Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. That's sort of been my comfort game for the past several months. So if anyone wants to hit me up in that, just hit up my DMs, and I'm down to just clown around in a lobby and help you grind stuff out, even if it's just anomaly ranks. Yeah, I think that's about it from me that I could think of.
Well, awesome. Thank you, thank you, Philip. I was going to call you Mr.Thee there
that's
for
fine.
A second, but
I respond to
both. But thank you for that. Always, good ways to be able to track you. So yeah, I'll definitely include any of those links for you. As well, if anyone does hit you up for Monster Hunter Rise, hopefully it is something that is a successful hunt. It's been a long time since I've played Monster Hunter, more than just stepping into it gently. So I think successful hunt is the best thing to say to someone, or wishes and hopes.
I think the phrase people use is happy hunting. I don't know if that's super formal, but that's what I've heard here and there.
So if anyone takes you up on it, or just in your own downtime to relax, happy hunting, Philip. I hope it goes well for you.
Thank you.
But as I said, if there wasn't anything else, I will let you get on with your day. I'll let you get on to your whatever else you have planned, and also going into the weekend, and also hopefully you can relax a little.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
So thanks again to Philip for making time to have this conversation with me, and thank you for joining us on the Red Tunic podcast, as well as a special thanks to Ronald Jenkins for the use of music from the title track from Road Steep. And be sure to check out the episode description for links to socials, websites, and other means that will allow you to learn more about or how to support Philip and the podcast. While you're doing that, also be sure to follow, subscribe, you know how all that works. Thanks, until next time.